Welcome back. In the previous section, we have explored a lot of things. We have talked about what is spring-data-jpa and how to configure our database creation approaches like using SQL scripts or using DDL auto generation. And then finally, we learned how to use flyway migrations. And then we have implemented our first UI screen where we fetch all the public shortened URLs and then display them in a tabular format. And before getting into implementing another feature of our URL shortener application, I would like to cover some Hibernate JPA related things so that we know how to effectively use spring-data-jpa. And if you are a Java developer, at some point of time, you are going to deal with null pointer exception, right? Most of us has to deal with null pointer exception. Similarly, if you are using JPA and Hibernate, at some point of time, you are going to deal with lazy loading exception. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what is lazy loading exception and how you can fix that exception. And we are going to talk about various ways of lazy loading the associated collections. And finally, we are going to talk about some JPA best practices. So let's get started. We have implemented our home page where we are displaying the public shortened URLs, and let us start the application and see it is still working fine. So application is started. Now I'm going to go to home page and we can see all the public shortened URLs. So it's working fine. Now let us pay attention to the console log. So here, when we ask to get the public shortened URLs, under the hood, it is going to generate this query where it fetches select all the columns from short URLs where is private is false and then ordering the result set. Okay. Now, if we are going to display who created it also, let's see what happens. So here I am going to update the UI. So in the index.html, I will add another header created by to show the username of created user. So I'm going to add a td th:\text url dot created by. If it is not equals to null, because that can be null. Okay, if it is not equals to null, I would like to display created by dot name. So basically created by is nothing but a user object and I am displaying the name property. And if it is null, I would like to show it as a guest. Okay, so let's restart and then see how it is going to behave. Okay, I'm going to clear my console and I'm going to refresh. So here you can see another column and all of them are from administrator. Okay, fine, it is working fine. But if you take a look at the generated SQLs, if you remember, we have enabled logging the generated SQL statements by using this spring-jpa show SQL equals to true. Okay, so here you can notice one query is fired to get all the shortened URLs from short URLs table and then filtering based on is private equals to false. And then there is another query triggered to fetch the user's information. Users in the sense who created that URL. In our case, in our sample insert script, we have inserted all the users created by one. Okay, so it only triggered one additional query to get the created user. But imagine if we have 10-20 different users and these are created by different people, user IDs, then it is going to fire additional queries for all of them to get associated user data also. So this is commonly known as n+1 select problem. So let us understand, in our case, it is not visible because it is only triggering one additional query to get user information, because we just have only one user and it is already loaded into cache. So it is not triggering n additional queries. It's only triggered only one query. But let us understand what is n plus 1 select problem. So imagine we are building, let's say, a blog application, and then there are posts and then associated comments. Now let's imagine we want to fetch n posts, maybe it is 10 or 20. We will fire this query to just return n posts. That is one query. This is going to return n rows. And then we also want to fetch comments associated with each of the posts. Then it is going to trigger another n queries to fetch comments of post ID 1, comments of post ID 2, etc., up to n queries. So this is commonly known as n plus 1 select problem. And while it is just working fine, it is going to be a huge performance issue in a real big applications. So how do we fix it? First thing, why it is automatically working? Is it supposed to work like this? Here is something we need to understand. In Spring Boot spring-data-jpa, there is a property called spring-data-jpa.openInView equals to. So the default value is true. The default value is true. What it does is, if you take a look at our code, so here is our controller, and then here is our call to service, and again we are calling this from a repository. Here it is going to load only short URLs. It is not going to load user information here because it is configured as lazy association, which means when we ask a JPA to fetch a short URL, by default it is not going to fetch the associated user information. Okay. Then in our controller, we are trying to render our index page where we are accessing created by information. If this feature is not available, open in view feature is not available, it is going to throw lazy loading association exception. So here, let us turn this off and see what happens. Now let us restart the application. And again, reload, and we got some error. Let us see what error we got. So if you take a look at the exception, could not initialize proxy, and it is saying user 1 is failed to initialize, and also here it shows no session, which means you are trying to render user information which is not yet loaded, and there is no session associated with the current work. Then it is throwing this Hibernate's lazy loading exception. But because this is a default value of true open in view, what is happening is, while rendering this time-lived template, spring-data-jpa and behind the scenes Hibernate is going to open a new session and then associate these entities with the session, so that when you access these lazy loaded collections or any associations, you are able to access them, and behind the scenes it is going to talk to the database and then lazily fetch that data using additional queries. That's why we are seeing first we got all the URLs information, but when we access this created by, it made another query to fetch the created by user information. But when we turn it off, it is throwing the exception because it is not opening this filter where it creates a session and then associate JPA entities. It is throwing the exception. So why can't we simply make it true and then we override with it? But as I mentioned, it is going to result in n+1 select problem. So I highly recommend the first thing when you do creating a Spring Boot JPA based application, set it to false, because this is going to be a performance issue sooner or later. So making it open in view set to false and then make your application work with the setting is very important. Okay, so now we have understand the problem of lazy loading. Now let us look at how we can fix this issue. Now let us go to short URL repository. Here you can see we are loading short URL objects where is private equals to false and otherwise so and so. So what we can do in order to eagerly load the association, we can write left join fetch su dot created by. Okay, so what we are doing, we are joining using left outer join. We are joining the users table and load associated user information as well. Okay, why we are using left join? Because our short URLs can also be created from guest users for which there is no associated created by ID. So we need to use left outer join. So here using JPQL, I'm using left join fetch su short URL dot created by. Okay, so with this, it is going to generate a query where it left outer join with users table and fetch the associated information as well. Now let us restart our application. And this time, if we go and try to refresh, it is working fine. And you can also see the information, the associated user's name. Okay, so now let us take a look at the console, how many queries it generated. You can see there is only one query, which selects all the data from, okay, so here from short URLs and then left join users and then rest of the things, it joins on the created by column with user's ID and fetch the data. Okay, so this is how you can use join fetch to fetch associated data eagerly. Okay, if there is another option where you might be tempted to change it to eager. Okay, but again, this is going to result in n+1 select problem. So instead of that, you should make this lazy and then try to load all the required information from the query. So you know the use case. So you should write your JPQL in such a way that you are loading all the necessary information instead of triggering the lazy loading and then firing a bunch of queries. So we have solved this problem of lazy loading. But is this the only way? No, we can use different processes like, okay, instead of triggering this to fetch associated user information, we can also use entity graph. Okay, so here you can specify attribute paths and what associated information you want to fetch also. Okay, this is another way. So in this JPQL, we are using the same query, but we are not specifying to load associated created by. Instead, we can also use entity graph and specify the attribute paths. So in this way also, let us go ahead and okay. So here again, you can see it has from short URLs left join users and it generated the query and loaded the associated data. So considering this open in view session is not a good practice, so we are going to turn it off and then we are going to take care of loading all the necessary data from our queries itself. So I would say we should design our JPA based applications in such a way that in our service layer itself, we should materialize all the data that we need for a use case and then return a DTO instead of returning the short URL itself. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a DTO for a short URL and then we are going to convert the short URL entity into short URL DTO in the service and return it. Okay, so I'm going to use a couple of features provided by IntelliJDA Ultimate to easily create a DTO. But if you do not have IntelliJDA, then you need to create the DTO manually. Okay. So what I'm going to do in models package, I'm going to create a short URL DTO. In IntelliJDA Ultimate, if you go to short URL entity, here you can see an option DTOs and Spring Data Projection. So click on that and create a DTO, which is going to open this dialog and select in which package you want to generate this DTO. I would like to generate it in models package. And you have the option either to create a class or a Java record. I'm going to use a Java record and select what are all the properties you want to include in this DTO from short URL entity. So here I would like to include all of them, but interesting thing is here when I select created by, it's a user object. So here it is showing some options of okay, how are you going to map the user properties into this DTO. So here I would like to create a separate class, again another DTO, calling user DTO inside a models package, and I can select which properties I want to include. I don't want to include all the password, role, or created it. In fact, I don't need email as well. So I am selecting only ID and name fields in this. Now, when I click on OK, you can see in models, we have user DTO with just selected properties. And then we have a short URL DTO here. Okay, let me format it a little bit. Only the fields we have selected. And here in created by, we have user DTO, not the user entity. Okay. Now in our short URL service, once we get the list of URL objects, we would like to convert them into list of short URL DTOs. So for that, I'm going to create a entity mapper. You can name it whatever you want. So this is going to be a Spring component. And I'm going to implement two methods. One is to convert user entity to user DTO. Another one is to convert a short URL entity to DTO. So let me create the implementation for it. So here I have created two methods. One is to convert user entity to user DTO. Another one is to convert short URL to short URL DTO. So first here we are checking whether created by is not equals to null, and then converting it into user DTO. And also we are just mapping the fields from short URL to short URL DTO. So nothing complex. Once we have this mapper, we can, let's say, dot map. So we are taking stream and then mapping, and we can call entity mapper to short URL DTO and to list, and change it to DTO. So here it's going to map all the list of short URL to short URL DTO list. So once we have that, let us change it to return type also. Fine. Okay. Now let us restart our application and see it should work everything as it is. In our template, we are using the same field name, so it shouldn't break anything. So let us go ahead and access our home page. It is working just fine. And also if we take a look at our console, it is getting all the data from a single query. So we are good here. So this is the overall. Okay, let me talk about a couple of best practices. As we have already discussed, this open in view by default, unfortunately, it is true for the convenience. This is true. We don't need to set it explicitly. If we don't set it explicitly, it is enabled by default, which is going to be a terrible choice in production. because in the development it looks like everything is working fine. Unless you check the generated queries in the console, you don't realize behind the scenes it may be generating a whole bunch of n+1 select queries, and you won't realize that until you put your application in production. Then you may have millions of records in your tables, and then all of a sudden your application is terribly slow. Okay, so always first change it to false to turn off open in view session filter, and then make sure you are materializing all the data. Materializing in the sense, for each use case you know what all data you need for this particular use case. So fetch all the necessary data, and if possible you can return a DTO, so that whoever is consuming this method, they don't need to worry about lazy loading exceptions and all that. Okay, so follow these practices, and always make sure to check how and what kind of a queries being generated behind the scenes. Okay, so we also talked about this n+1 select problem. In our application we have not seen this, but you get the point, right? You can fire a query and then get n rows, and for each n rows, if you load associated collection, it's going to result another n queries, which is basically n+1. So I think whatever we discussed in this section will help us to prevent this n+1 lazy loading. So here we have loaded only many-to-one association, but the same process applies even for loading a child collection as well. Okay, so again I am going to remove these two. Instead I prefer to use a single JPQL with left join fetch. Okay, so this is our implementation for this use case, and we are good to move on to the next feature implementation, which is creating a short URL. Okay, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next section. Bye bye.